The children of the mill. Grooming, empire, false categories, and the children Britain refused to govern. By Elias Winter. June 1st, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. The girls no one wanted to see. Between the late 1990s and the early 2010s, a series of British towns exposed a pattern of group-based child sexual exploitation that had been missed, minimized, or mishandled for years. The first thing to say is not that the men were Pakistani. The first thing to say is that the victims were children. In Rotherham, the independent inquiry chaired by Alexis Jay estimated that at least 1,400 children were sexually exploited between 1997 and 2013. The abuse included grooming, rape, trafficking, threats, abduction, violence, intimidation, and organized sexual exploitation. Many of the children were already known to social services. Some were in care. Some were treated by authorities as troublesome, promiscuous, unreliable, or difficult before they were treated as victims. The system had a category for their disorder before it had a category for their violation. Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council, J. Report. The methods were not mysterious. Adult men approached girls with food, alcohol, drugs, rides, gifts, flattery, shelter, attention. They offered affection to children who had already been half abandoned by family, school, care systems, class, or the state. They gave them lifts. They gave them cigarettes. They gave them alcohol. They gave them somewhere to go when home was dangerous or empty. They learned which girls could disappear for a night without anyone urgent enough looking for them. Then the kindness changed shape. The girls were raped. They were threatened. They were moved between cars, flats, houses, takeaways, taxi routes, and town centers after dark. Some were passed between men. Some were trafficked to other towns. Some were assaulted when they resisted. Some were told their families would be harmed. Some were told no one would believe them. Often the men did not need to hide completely. Their power came from partial visibility. The girls were seen in cars. They were seen outside takeaways. They were seen drunk, frightened, missing, bruised, pregnant, infected, silent, hysterical, disbelieved. Mothers complained. Care workers knew fragments. Police heard names. Social workers saw patterns. Hospitals treated consequences. Taxi ranks and nighttime economies carried rumors. The crimes were not invisible. They were insufficiently interrupted. Rotherham became the emblem, but it was not the only place. Rochdale, Oxford, Telford, Derby, Oldham, and other towns exposed related patterns of group-based exploitation. The cases differed. The offender networks differed. The victims differed. The institutional failures differed. But the national wound became recognizable. Vulnerable girls, often working class and already known to agencies, were exploited by groups of adult men, while public institutions failed to act with the urgency required. In several British towns, specific British Pakistani, often Mirpuri or Kashmiri origin, male networks were disproportionately visible in a particular form of group-based sexual exploitation, while public institutions failed to confront the ethnic, cultural, class, gendered, economic, and network patterns honestly. Ethnicity matters here not because ancestry explains crime, but because institutions cannot protect children from networks they refuse to describe. Culture can help explain a pattern. It must never excuse a crime. The scandal began as crime. It became national disgrace because the crimes were visible enough to stop and still continued. The men committed the crimes. Public institutions preserved the conditions by failing to act. 2. The false category. The word Muslim is doing too much work. It is asked to describe belief, ancestry, civilization, immigration status, family discipline, geopolitical identity, racial suspicion, census classification, religious practice, state ideology, and sometimes the silence of people who no longer believe but cannot safely say so. That is not a category. It is a collapse. If Muslim means a religion, then it must include the possibility of conscience. A person must be able to enter, remain, reinterpret, doubt, criticize, or leave. Without that possibility, the word does not function as faith. It functions as inheritance. It becomes a label placed over the child before the child has had the chance to become a person. A child is not born Muslim in the way she is born with lungs. She is born into a family that may call itself Muslim. Whether that word becomes her faith, her memory, her wound, her rebellion, or nothing at all must belong to her. This is not a semantic complaint. It is a political and moral one. When British institutions, journalists, activists, bureaucrats, or demagogues say the Muslim community, they often pretend to be describing something real. But there is no single Muslim community. There are Muslims, Muslim background people, Islamic institutions, national diasporas, ethnic enclaves, sectarian traditions, secular minorities, ex-Muslims, converts, Shia, Sunni, Ahmadis, Ismailis, Arabs, Iranians, Pakistanis, Somalis, Turks, Bosnians, Kurds, Malaysians, Albanians, Nigerians, and people who have nothing in common except that British bureaucracy and media language place the same word over them. The phrase, the Muslim community, is not a description. It is a management device. It lets the state deal with spokesmen instead of persons. It lets institutions ask elders what the community thinks. It lets mosque committees, ethnic brokers, religious intermediaries, and self-appointed representatives stand in for women, children, dissenters, atheists, sexual minorities, secular sons, frightened daughters, and people who are publicly compliant but privately gone. Iran exposes the fraud inside the category. On paper, Iran is one of the most Islamic states in the world, a Shia theocracy, ruled through clerical institutions, law, compulsion, and the memory of revolution. Yet precisely because Islam became the machinery of state power, millions of Iranians have become secular, anti-clerical, privately atheist, culturally Persian before they are religious, or spiritually exhausted by the official faith imposed in their name. To call them simply Muslim is not description. It is erasure. Lebanon is not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not the UAE. Iran is not Pakistan. Pakistan is not Turkey. Turkey is not Bosnia. Bosnia is not Somalia. Shia history is not Sunni history. Persianate civilization is not Gulf tribal monarchy. Urban Tehran is not rural Mirpur. A secular Iranian immigrant is not a Deobandi cleric. A Lebanese Christian is not a Saudi Wahhabi. A British Pakistani surgeon is not a taxi rank predator. A Muslim background atheist is not the mosque that would condemn him. The word collapses all this and then asks politics to be intelligent. It cannot be. The word Pakistani also fails if treated as one moral object. Pakistan contains elite urban professionals, military families, secular intellectuals, Shia minorities, Ahmadis, Ismailis, Barelvis, Deobandis, Pashtuns, Punjabis, Sindhis, Baloch, Muhajirs, Kashmiris, rural poor, feudal worlds, cosmopolitan diasporas, patriarchal kinship structures, and young people who want nothing to do with any inherited authority. Pakistani identity contains radically different social types: the surgeon, the student, the secular daughter, the Shia professional, the Ahmadi businessman, the rural cousin imported through marriage. the mosque elder, the taxi rank predator, the feminist lawyer, the ex-Muslim son. To make them one thing is to abandon thought. The same is true of immigrant. An individual professional immigrant who enters through education, language, employment, credentialing, and conscious civic participation is not the same social phenomenon as low-wage chain migration from a rural, kinship-governed, patriarchal community into a deprived town. Both are human beings. Both have dignity, but they are not the same policy event. Bad categories produce bad politics. They allow denial on one side and collective blame on the other. The liberal bureaucrat says Muslim community and refuses to see the child who wants out. The far-right agitator says Muslim community and refuses to see the individual who never belonged to the crime. Both flatten the person. Both use the wrong unit of analysis. The problem begins when a word meant to describe faith becomes a container for ancestry, migration, class, geopolitics, family authority, state theology, and inherited obedience. The first violence is against the child. The second is against language. Once the state calls everyone Muslim, it loses the ability to see the child who does not believe, the woman who wants out, the Iranian who despises clerics, the Pakistani professional who shares nothing with the offender, the Shia who is not Sunni, the secular son hiding inside a religious surname. Bad categories are not innocent. They decide who can be seen. 3. The men who came for the night shift. They did not arrive as a theory of multiculturalism. They came for work. The first generation of many British Pakistani and Mirpuri origin migrants entered a Britain that needed labor. Post-war Britain had mills to run, foundries to fill, buses to drive, steel to make, factories to staff, machines to keep moving through the night. The country had lost men to war, reshaped its economy, expanded public services, and still imagined itself as an imperial center, even after empire had begun to leave its hands. The men came from Pakistan and in very large numbers from Mirpur and surrounding areas of Azad Kashmir, as well as parts of Punjab. Many were rural. Many were working class. Many were not highly educated. Many did not arrive with fluent English or a developed picture of British civic life. Many came through kinship chains, one man, then a brother, then a cousin, then a nephew, then someone from the same village. A diaspora is not a random sample of a homeland. It is a selection event. British Pakistanis were never simply Pakistan in Britain. They were disproportionately shaped by particular regions, classes, villages, migration chains, and labor markets. In the Mirpuri case, the construction of the Mangla Dam in the 1960s displaced large numbers of people from Mirpur and surrounding areas. Compensation, existing family links, and Britain's post-war labor demand helped accelerate migration into British industrial towns. Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Center. This matters because chain migration does not move only individuals. It moves relationships. It moves marriage markets. It moves obligations. It moves reputations. It moves language. It moves elders. It moves clerics. It moves gossip. It moves surveillance. It moves a village into a street, then into a ward, then into a school, then into the private grammar of a town. The first men often came with the myth of return. They would work, save, send remittances, build houses back home, return with status. Britain was not necessarily imagined as a final home. It was a workplace, a wage, a cold island where money could be extracted and sent back to warmer obligations. But history has a way of turning temporary arrangements into permanent facts. Men brought families. Children were born. industries declined. The houses back home became less real than the terrace in Bradford, Oldham, Rochdale, Blackburn, Luton, Birmingham. The temporary worker became the father of a British child. And Britain, which had invited the worker, had not prepared itself for the citizen. This is the first betrayal. Not that poor men moved toward wages. That is ordinary human history. The betrayal was that Britain treated migration as a labor market instrument while refusing to ask, early enough and seriously enough, what kind of society would be built when those laborers stayed. The industries were not incidental. Textiles, cotton, wool, steel, foundries, engineering, car manufacturing, food processing, public transport, rail, and buses all formed part of the post-war labor landscape. These were not glamorous jobs. Many were dirty, loud, dangerous, repetitive, badly timed, low status, or organized around shifts that local workers increasingly refused on the available terms. The men who came from Mirpur, Punjab, Pakistan, and Kashmir did not invent Britain's need for them. The need was made in mills, boardrooms, factories, steelworks, foundries, transport depots, and government offices. It was made by owners, managers, personnel departments, trade associations, state planners, and local employers who wanted shifts filled without having to transform the conditions of work. By the 1950s and 1960s, this was less a story of individual mill lords than of corporate capitalism, state industry, personnel departments, public transport authorities, and local employers. Some employers were private, some were public, some were old industrial families, some were nationalized systems, but together they formed the labor landscape that absorbed Commonwealth workers while postponing the civic question of settlement. Virinder Kalra's work on Pakistani/Kashmiri labor in Oldham places this transition inside the wider history of migration, labor, deindustrialization, and movement from textile work into later economic niches. Virinder S. Kalra, From Textile Mills to Taxi Ranks. Britain's industrial and managerial elite needed workers for jobs that many local British workers increasingly refused on the available terms. Dirty jobs, night shifts, noisy mills, dangerous foundries, low-status labor, bad hours, declining industries. They could have raised wages. They could have improved conditions. They could have shortened shifts. They could have invested in safer workplaces. They could have asked whether keeping exhausted industries alive through imported labor would create long-term civic obligations. Instead, too often, they found workers with fewer alternatives. This was not a contradiction of British racism. It was one of its old imperial forms. The British elite did not have to imagine Pakistani or Mirpuri men as future equals in order to use them as workers. Empire had trained the mind to separate usefulness from fellowship. A colonial subject could be considered inferior and still be recruited as a soldier. A Commonwealth migrant could be socially unwelcome and economically necessary. The ruling instinct was not always keep them out. Sometimes it was keep them down, keep them useful, keep the factory running. They did not need to imagine these men as future citizens. They needed them for the night shift. That is why this was not merely an immigration story. It was a class story. The people who benefited from low-wage labor were usually not the people who absorbed the consequences of rapid settlement. The owners did not live in the most strained streets. Their daughters were not in the same care homes. Their schools were not remade by linguistic isolation. Their neighborhoods did not become the testing ground for Britain's refusal to govern difference. The cost was dumped downward, onto white working-class towns, onto migrant families themselves, onto schools, councils, police, social workers, and later, onto girls. The line from the mill to the grooming scandal is not a straight line of causation. Industrial recruitment did not produce rape. Migration did not produce rape. Poverty did not produce rape. Islam did not produce rape. Men raped children because they chose to. But the civic landscape in which those crimes persisted, segregated settlement, deindustrialized towns, night economies, weak institutions, racial anxiety, class contempt, and outsourced community authority, was produced by political choices made long before the police failed the first girl. Britain wanted labor without fully preparing for settlement. 4. When the mills died. The original bargain collapsed. The men had come for industries that were already weakening. Textiles declined, steel contracted, foundries closed, manufacturing shrank. The post-war industrial town lost the very thing that had justified the migrants' presence in the first place. The worker remained. The work disappeared. This is where the story becomes multi-generational. The first generation had entered mills, factories, foundries, buses, steelworks, workshops. The second and third generations inherited a landscape of unemployment, underemployment, self-employment, taxis, takeaways, corner shops, restaurants, market stalls, small retail, family businesses, and public sector routes where education made escape possible. The visible economic transition in many towns was from the mill to the taxi rank, from factory floor to private hire, from night shift to night economy, from industrial discipline to family enterprise. Kalra's From Textile Mills to Taxi Ranks captures this transition in its very title. It is not a metaphor only. It is a social history. Virinder S. Kalra. Taxi work became attractive because it required limited formal credentials, could be entered through kinship networks, allowed self-employment, used local knowledge, tolerated imperfect institutional English, and operated in towns where the old employment base had collapsed. Takeaways, curry houses, kebab shops, convenience stores, and small shops followed a similar logic. Family labor, long hours, pooled capital, community credit, survival through self-exploitation. Taxi work did not cause grooming. Takeaways did not cause rape. But some economic niches created access to night streets, vulnerable girls, informal male groups, cars, flats, late hours, weakly regulated spaces, and the knowledge of who could be moved without immediate consequence. Where one part of the community entered professions, another remained tied to enclave economies. The community split. There are British Pakistanis who became doctors, pharmacists, academics, lawyers, entrepreneurs, MPs, councillors, teachers, civil servants, police officers, engineers, accountants, and professionals. There are secular Pakistanis, liberal Muslims, reformist Muslims, Shia Pakistanis, Ahmadis, feminists, ex-Muslims, cosmopolitan urban families, university-educated daughters, boys and girls who entered the British public square and did not look back. There are also localities where inherited deprivation, low female employment, conservative mosque authority, limited English among some older women or incoming spouses, cousin marriage, biradari politics, religious schooling, family pressure, gender segregation, and distrust of the state persisted. The community did not become one thing. It split into Britain. Some entered the public square. Some remained inside private sovereignties. Households, religious networks, kinship structures, reputation systems, and local male hierarchies that the state often mistook for community leadership. By private sovereignty, I mean any local authority, family, mosque, kinship network, ethnic broker, religious intermediary, or reputation system that claims practical power over a child's life while remaining formally outside the law. This is why broad labels fail. Pakistani is too crude. Muslim is too crude. Immigrant is too crude. The surgeon and the street predator are not the same social fact. The secular daughter and the controlling uncle are not the same moral subject. The integrated professional and the patriarchal enclave are not one thing because a census category says so. But public perception is rarely that careful. When the worst of a visible minority becomes the story, the best of that minority inherits suspicion. 5. Parallel lives, private sovereignties. The phrase parallel lives emerged after the Northern English disturbances of 2001, when towns such as Oldham, Burnley, and Bradford forced Britain to confront the fact that some communities were living near one another without living with one another. The phrase was not perfect. No phrase is. But it named something real: the existence of local worlds where schools, housing, marriage, religion, language, friendship, and political representation could become ethnically and religiously bounded. Ted Cantle, Parallel Lives. A state can tolerate cultural difference. It cannot tolerate private sovereignty. There are legitimate issues here, and naming them is not scapegoating. Forced marriage is one. In 2024, the UK Forced Marriage Unit received 812 contacts related to possible forced marriage and or possible female genital mutilation. In the cases where the FMU gave advice or support, 74% of victims were British nationals, and Pakistan was the focus country in 45% of cases. Those figures do not say Pakistanis force marriage. They say something narrower and more serious. There are British citizens, often young, often female, whose freedom can be constrained by family systems with transnational reach. UK Forced Marriage Unit Statistics, 2024. They may be taken abroad. They may be pressured into marriage. They may be told that refusal dishonors the family. They may face threats, isolation, passport control, emotional blackmail, violence, or abandonment. That is not culture as ornament. That is culture as power. Honor-based abuse is another issue. It can include threats, assault, coercion, forced marriage, sexual control, and punishment for behavior seen as dishonoring the family. It is not exclusive to Pakistani communities. It is not exclusive to Muslims. But in some conservative South Asian Muslim background family systems, honor and shame can become mechanisms of control over women, girls, and dissenting youth. UK safeguarding and forced marriage guidance treats these issues as matters for public protection, not private family discretion. UK Forced Marriage Unit Statistics, 2024. Apostasy is another. A child born into a conservative Muslim family may be legally free to leave Islam, but formal liberty is not the same as usable liberty. A young person who no longer believes may still depend on parents for housing, money, safety, siblings, community, marriage prospects, inheritance, reputation, and belonging. To say, "I do not believe," can mean exile from the only world that raised them. This is not theoretical. The Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain has told Parliament that many ex-Muslims live closeted lives because they fear backlash. Faith to Faithless, a humanist's UK support program for people leaving high-control religious groups, describes apostates facing shunning, disownment, emotional and physical abuse, isolation, anxiety, depression, and self-harm risk. Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain evidence to Parliament. Faith to Faithless/Humanists UK. Gender and sexuality are also fault lines. Girls may be monitored by brothers, cousins, fathers, mothers, aunties, mosque networks, community gossip. Clothing, friendship, dating, travel, phone use, university choice, marriage, sexuality, all can become matters not of personal development, but of collective reputation. LGBT youth may face religious condemnation and family expulsion. A daughter may become the border on which the family imagines its honor stands. Cousin marriage and consanguinity raise public health concerns in some localities, especially where close relative marriage is repeated across generations. The Born in Bradford evidence base found high rates of consanguinity among Pakistani heritage families and linked consanguineous marriage to increased risk of congenital anomalies, while also emphasizing the need for careful, non-stigmatizing health communication. This issue must not be handled with disgust or racial superiority. It must be handled as medicine, genetics, counseling, and honest public health. But silence is not respect. Silence is abandonment disguised as sensitivity. Born in Bradford Genes and Health Evidence Briefing. Schools become battlegrounds because children are where the state and the family meet. Sex education, LGBT curriculum, biology, religious dress, faith schools, gender mixing, safeguarding, and civic education all become tests of sovereignty. Does the child belong to the family's religious authority, or to herself as a future citizen? The answer must be clear. Parents have rights, religions have power, communities have traditions, but none of them owns the child. The minority child is not a cultural asset. She is not evidence of diversity. She is not the honor of the family. She is not the reputation of a mosque. She is not the property of elders. She is not a diplomatic object between the state and community leaders. She is a citizen before she knows the word. This is the distinction Britain has too often failed to make. In the name of multicultural sensitivity, the state has sometimes treated conservative male intermediaries as the voice of the community. Mosque committees, elders, biradari brokers, local businessmen, patriarchs, religious authorities. These men are invited to speak, calm, represent, explain. But who speaks for the girl who wants to leave? Who speaks for the boy who no longer believes? Who speaks for the daughter who does not want the cousin? Who speaks for the gay son? Who speaks for the woman who wants police, not mediation? You do not ask the jailer to describe the prisoner's freedom. To name these things is not to say Pakistani Muslims are uniquely wicked. Every community contains structures capable of hiding cruelty. The Catholic Church hid priests. Elite schools hid masters. Hollywood hid predators. Families hide fathers. Universities hide reputations. Mosques can hide imams. Biradaris can hide uncles. Political parties hide donors. Police forces hide misconduct. The problem is not blood. The problem is private power protected by reputation. The state's duty is not to humiliate communities. The state's duty is to reach the child before the community becomes a wall. 6. The reputation tax. The cruelest thing about collapsed categories is that the innocent inherit the suspicion created by the unpunished. A grooming gang offender in Rotherham becomes a shadow over a Pakistani doctor in London. A forced marriage case becomes a burden carried by a British Pakistani woman who left that world behind. A conservative mosque elder becomes the public face of a secular son who despises him. A Mirpuri taxi rank predator becomes, in the eyes of the careless, Muslim men. Then, Muslim men becomes immigrants. Then immigrants becomes the problem. This is the reputation tax. The fact that this tax is predictable does not make it legitimate. It is paid by people who did not commit the crime, did not defend the culture, did not build the enclave, did not run the mosque, did not silence the girls, did not hire the workers, did not design the policy, did not benefit from the mills, and did not refuse to record relevant facts in police files. The surgeon pays for the predator. The secular daughter pays for the imam. The Iranian pays for the Mirpuri. The Shia pays for the Sunni. The student who passed the TOEFL pays for the cousin imported into a closed household. The professional immigrant who entered through language, education, and law pays for a migration model Britain never governed. This is not fair, but it is predictable. When institutions refuse to name specific patterns, the public supplies crude ones. When the state says nothing to see, people learn to see too much. When officials suppress ethnic facts in the name of harmony, they do not prevent racism. They manufacture the conditions under which racial suspicion becomes impossible to contain. This is why denial harmed integrated Pakistanis. It did not protect them. It attached them to the unpunished. A serious state would have said early, yes, there is a localized British Pakistani and Mirpuri or Kashmiri origin offender pattern in some towns. Yes, we will investigate it without fear. No, this does not indict all Pakistanis. No, this does not indict all Muslim background people. No, this does not indict all immigrants. Yes, we will protect girls inside and outside those communities. Yes, we will record ethnicity and nationality where relevant, accurately, consistently, and lawfully. Yes, we will prosecute offenders without cultural hesitation. Yes, we will defend innocent people against collective blame. That is what adulthood sounds like. Instead, Britain too often oscillated between euphemism and panic. The liberal professional class feared naming the pattern. The far right named the pattern, and then lied about its meaning. The result was a double betrayal. Victims abandoned by denial. Innocence endangered by backlash. 7. The false answers. The first false answer is denial. Denial says, culture is irrelevant. Only individuals commit crimes. This is not serious. Individuals do commit crimes, but individuals act inside networks, economies, silences, opportunities, moral codes, gender norms, and institutional hesitations. If a group of men repeatedly exploits girls through taxis, takeaways, kinship, ethnic familiarity, night economies, and community silence, then networks matter. Culture matters. Class matters. Masculinity matters. The town matters. The police file matters. To say this is not racism. It is pattern recognition. The second false answer is collective blame. Collective blame says, this proves Pakistanis are alien, Muslims are dangerous, immigrants are a threat. This is also not serious. It is a lazy metaphysics of blood. It cannot distinguish between an offender and a surgeon, between a forced marriage victim and her father, between an ex-Muslim daughter and the mosque that shames her, between Iranian Shia culture and rural Mirpuri Sunni conservatism, between a professional immigrant and post-war chain migration. Collective blame is not analysis. It is contamination theory. The third false answer is remigration fantasy. Most British Pakistanis are British, born there, raised there, educated there, employed there, taxed there, buried there. Mass removal would require not immigration enforcement, but ethnic authoritarianism. Deporting non-citizen serious offenders is legitimate. Tightening future migration rules is legitimate. Refusing forced marriage and coercive sponsorship is legitimate. But treating British-born citizens as removable because of ancestry is a war against citizenship itself. The fourth false answer is sentimental multiculturalism. This says communities should be respected, leaders consulted, sensitivities managed, religious identity affirmed, representation balanced. Sometimes that is merely bureaucratic. Sometimes it is necessary to keep order. But when a girl is being controlled by her family, when a child is being prepared for forced marriage, when a boy fears apostasy, when a woman fears honor violence, community consultation can become the state laundering cowardice through the language of respect. A serious state cannot outsource conscience to elders. It cannot ask the men who benefit from silence to design the policy of speech. It cannot protect children by negotiating with the private sovereignties that constrain them. The fifth false answer is religious institutional apologetics. This says the problem is only prejudice, only misunderstanding, only poverty, only media panic, only racism, only the far right. It treats religious and communal institutions as if they are automatically protective, automatically representative, automatically entitled to deference. They are not. This essay is not a program for protecting Islamic institutions in the West. It is an argument for protecting persons from inherited religious and communal authority. The unit of concern is not the mosque, the family, the ethnic association, the census category, or the spokesman. The unit of concern is the child who must be free to become more than the label placed on her. The correct answer is harder. Protect conscience. Break inherited religious coercion. Protect the person, not the institution. Protect the child, not the community's claim over the child. Name the offender. Name the network. Name the institution that failed. Name the elite that benefited. Name the category that lied. No idea deserves immunity from criticism because it is sacred. No person deserves collective punishment because of the word placed over them. 8. Citizenship against inheritance. The solution is not revenge. The solution is civic seriousness. A serious state does not ask whether the child belongs to Islam, Pakistan, Kashmir, the mosque, the family, the father, the elder, the census box, or the community. It asks whether she can say no. One law. No religious or cultural defense for grooming, rape, forced marriage, coercive control, intimidation, honor abuse, female subordination, child removal abroad, or threats against apostates. The law must not ask whether the perpetrator's community will be embarrassed. Embarrassment is not a legal category. Safeguarding must be absolute. Children first. Culture second. Reputation nowhere. Police, councils, schools, hospitals, social workers, and care homes must record patterns accurately. Suspect ethnicity, nationality where relevant, network structure, location, business links, victim profile, institutional failure. Not for propaganda, for intelligence. If facts are not recorded, patterns cannot be seen. If patterns cannot be seen, children cannot be protected. No mosque committee, religious board, elder network, biradari broker, race relations consultant, local businessman, or community representative should have veto power over safeguarding, sex education, LGBT safety, biology, civic curriculum, police action, or the rights of women and children. Real exit. The state should fund and defend exit infrastructure, women's shelters, forced marriage protection, ex-Muslim support, LGBT youth services, confidential school reporting, legal aid, safe housing, emergency relocation, passport protection, and training for teachers, GPs, police, and universities. A child who says, "My family is taking me to Pakistan and I am afraid," should trigger a system. A girl who says, "I am being pressured to marry," should trigger a system. A boy who says, "I no longer believe and I am afraid to go home," should trigger a system. A young woman who says, "Do not tell my parents," should be believed when telling them would endanger her. English language competence is part of this exit infrastructure. English is not cultural vanity. It is access to law, school, doctors, police, employment, contracts, courts, friendships, and escape. A spouse brought into Britain without functional English can become dependent on the very household that may control her. The public language is not an insult to Urdu, Pahari, Punjabi, Arabic, Persian, or any ancestral tongue. It is the bridge to citizenship. A country may allow many languages. It cannot allow civic illiteracy as a permanent settlement model. Governed settlement. A serious country does not pretend all immigration is the same. High-skill individual migration, refugee protection, temporary labor, family reunification, marriage migration, low-wage labor importation, and chain migration have different civic consequences. A professional immigrant who enters through language, education, employment, and institutional legibility is not the same social phenomenon as mass rural chain migration into a deprived town. This is not a moral hierarchy of human worth. It is a policy distinction about integration risk and civic capacity. Long-term settlement and citizenship should normally require English, civic knowledge, clean, serious criminal record, genuine consent in marriage sponsorship, economic self-sufficiency where possible, and the ability to interact with public institutions without community intermediaries. Humanitarian exceptions must exist. Protection must exist for abused spouses, trafficked people, refugees, children, and people trapped inside coercive households. Integration policy must increase freedom, not punish the already controlled. But settlement policy alone is not enough. The white working-class girl in Rotherham and the Pakistani girl in Bradford were both failed by the same abandoned state. Deindustrialization, poor schools, weak youth services, broken housing, thin policing, underfunded care systems, and local corruption created the hunting ground. To enforce law without rebuilding civic capacity is to punish symptoms and preserve conditions. Nor can elite insulation continue. The people who design migration systems should live with their consequences. This is a principle, not a logistics proposal. No more labor importation whose costs are borne only by poor towns. No more moral lectures from classes whose schools, streets, daughters, and institutions are protected from the experiments they endorse. A serious state must stop confusing softness with goodness. The child does not need the state to be soft. The child needs the state to arrive. 9. The child against the community. The final question is not immigration, it is sovereignty. Who owns the child? The family says, "We do." The community says, "We do." The religion says, "We do." The state sometimes says nothing, because it is afraid of seeming cruel. The market says nothing, because the child does not appear on the balance sheet. The predator says nothing, because silence is the condition of his access. And the child waits, learning the geography of adult cowardice. The grooming scandals were one form of this failure. The girl in care became disposable because the state had already decided what kind of child she was. Troubled, sexualized, difficult, unreliable, working class. Already lost. She was not protected because she was not imagined as innocent enough. The forced marriage victim is another form. She becomes the honor of the family before she becomes the owner of herself. The ex-Muslim son is another. He becomes a betrayal before he becomes a conscience. The lesbian daughter is another. She becomes shame before she becomes a person. The integrated Pakistani professional is another. He becomes a representative of crimes he did not commit. The Iranian is another. He becomes Muslim because Western language cannot see the distance between a theocratic state and a secularized soul. The immigrant who entered through language and law is another. He becomes part of a category made toxic by policies he did not design. The first-generation Mirpuri laborer is another. He becomes, in retrospect, the symbol of a failure he did not fully author. He came because Britain needed him. He worked the shifts Britain offered. He entered the factory, and then history moved his children into an argument he could not have understood. But the child remains the center. Not the nation as fantasy. Not the community as idol. Not religion as reputation. Not industry as necessity. Not immigration as ideology. Not the category. The child. A child born into a Muslim background family must have the right to remain Muslim, become a different kind of Muslim, leave Islam, criticize Islam, marry freely, refuse marriage, be gay, be secular, speak English, call police, love Britain, love Pakistan, reject both, and belong to herself. A child born into a poor white family must have the right not to be treated as disposable, because her class has already been written off. A child born into any community must have the right to become more than the community's plan. This is where citizenship either becomes real or reveals itself as decoration. The state does not need to abolish tradition. It must abolish ownership. It does not need to humiliate religion. It must abolish coercion. It does not need to punish ancestry. It must punish crime. It does not need to end immigration. It must govern settlement. It does not need to choose between anti-racism and truth. It must understand that lies are what make racism powerful. The scandal was never only that men raped girls. It was that Britain could not decide what a child was. A child in care became a nuisance. A child in a migrant family became a cultural possession. A child in a religious community became a symbol. A child in a poor town became disposable. But a child is not a symbol. She is not the honor of a family, the shame of a mosque, the proof of multiculturalism, the evidence of invasion, the cost of textile labor, or the sacrifice demanded by the peace of the town. She is not born to vindicate a category. She is not born to redeem an empire. She is not born to preserve a father's reputation. She is the citizen before the citizen knows her name. And the first duty of the state is to reach her before the men do. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.